A bright yellow Lamborghini screeches to a halt in front of Mark's house, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust on the pavement. The doors swing open, and a team of gardeners in green uniforms step out, tools in hand, ready to do their job. Meanwhile, Brenda, the HOA president, stands by, clipboard in hand, a smug smile spreading across her face. Mark watches from his window, holding a coffee cup, eyes fixed on his precious piece of land. He's been preparing for this moment. "Mark, today's the last day I let you destroy my garden." He turns away, opens his laptop, and clicks send an official email to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Just as the landscaping crew begins to haul out machinery, the sound of a police siren fills the air. A yellow Lamborghini with government plates rolls up in front of the house. A FBI agent dressed in tactical gear steps out, walking with the determined pace of someone who doesn't care about Brenda or the landscaping crew. FBI agent holding up a megaphone, voice cold. "Stop right there. This is a protected wildlife habitat under the Endangered Species Act. No one is allowed to destroy this area." Brenda, screaming in frustration, "You don't have authority. This land belongs to the HOA. I'm the president. I signed the contract with this company." FBI agent, turning to Brenda, voice stern. "Ma'am, this is a federal crime. You violated the Endangered Species Act. You will face federal charges." Mark watches from his window, a victorious grin creeping across his face. This isn't just about plants anymore. It's a battle to protect a piece of nature that no system can trample on. The sound of high heels clicking sharply against the pavement echoed through the quiet suburban street. Brenda, president of the HOA, walked with an air of authority, her head held high, eyes scanning every inch of Mark's lawn with an almost predatory gaze. She was dressed in her signature attire, a beige crisp polo shirt tucked into khaki capri pants, and a visor tilted low to shield her eyes from the sun, though it couldn't hide the sneer playing at her lips. She stopped at the property line, precisely 3 feet into Mark's yard, never once stepping off the pristine manicured curb. To her, this was an invasion, a violation of order. Her hand gripped the clipboard like a shield, her finger tapping against it in a rhythmic, almost methodical pattern. "Brenda, Mark, I trust you received the notice." Her voice was sharp and condescending, like a teacher scolding a misbehaving student. There was no room for negotiation, only compliance. Mark turned a slight sigh, escaping his lips, as he locked eyes with her, the very embodiment of control and authority. He could already tell where this was heading, but today would be different. Today, he had a weapon in his corner, the law. "Mark, yes, Brenda. I got it. $500 fine. For Clover." He held up the notice with an almost mocking air, watching her eyes narrow as she adjusted her visor, lips curling slightly as if she had just smelled something foul. "Brenda, not just Clover. Mark, it's unauthorized non-turf vegetation. That's against the HOA bylaws." She didn't wait for him to respond before she delivered her next line with military precision. "Brenda, Article 4, Section 2. Front lawns must be 90% approved turf grass. You have a patch of weeds in the middle of your lawn. And that," she gestured sharply toward the clover, "is an eyesore." She flicked her wrist as if swatting away a fly, dismissing the very concept of nature, fighting back against the rigid standards she swore to uphold. Mark could feel his blood pressure rising, but he didn't let it show. He'd heard it all before. The HOA's obsession with conformity, the rules, the fines, the threats. He had been in this war for years, but now it felt personal. "Mark, it's a living, breathing patch of nature, Brenda. It's green, it's thriving, it's good for the soil. What's wrong with that, Brenda? What's wrong is that it breaks the uniformity of our streetscape. The Oaks at Willow Creek is a premier community. Potential buyers don't want to see this." She gestured toward the lush, buzzing patch of clover, as if it were a crime scene. "Brenda, they want seamless lawns. They want Kentucky bluegrass or tall fescue, not a hippie salad bar." Her words hung in the air, cold and disdainful, as she stabbed a finger at the clover like it was a contagious disease. Mark felt the familiar twinge of anger, but he kept it contained, letting her speak her piece. Brenda was used to being in charge. She had held that position for years, dictating rules, punishing transgressions, and always winning. But this time, she had underestimated the power of nature and the power of the law. The morning after the confrontation, Mark stood at the window watching as Brenda made her rounds. She wasn't alone this time. She had brought a couple of other HOA enforcers, clipboard in hand, scanning every lawn as they went. Their eyes always seemed to pause longer on Mark's yard. As they passed his property line, Mark saw Brenda glance over at his patch of clover, her lips curling into a disapproving frown. But this time she didn't stop. She simply made a note on her clipboard and continued down the street. Later that day, Mark saw the telltale envelope wedged awkwardly into his mailbox. His stomach dropped. He ripped it open, already knowing what was inside. Once again, Brenda's scornful handwriting filled the official notice. It read, "Unauthorized non-turf vegetation present. Fine $500. Failure to remove clover by Friday will result in further action." Mark stared at the notice, clenching his fists. This wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about control. He had a sinking feeling this wouldn't be the last of it. Mark muttering under his breath, "Just wait, Brenda. You have no idea what's coming." The next morning, Mark went out to water his lawn as usual, but as soon as the hose hit the grass, the sound of approaching footsteps reached his ears. He turned around to find Dave from next door, a self-proclaimed yes man of the neighborhood, standing just outside his yard with his hands on his hips. "Dave, hey Mark, Brenda told me to let you know you've got until Friday. You can't ignore the rules, man." He shuffled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable being the messenger. "Dave, she's just trying to keep the neighborhood nice, you know? Everyone else is paying to keep their lawns perfect. You should just fix it." Mark's irritation flared, but he forced a smile. "Mark, thanks for the reminder, Dave, but I'm good. You can tell Brenda I'm not going to destroy my garden." Dave shrugged, looking like a man caught between doing what was right and keeping Brenda off his back. "Dave, look, I don't want to get in the middle of this, but you should probably do something. She's not going to let this go. I've seen her go after worse." With that, Dave turned and walked back toward his house, casting a nervous glance at Mark before disappearing inside. Mark felt the weight of the violation hanging in the air like a thick fog. The warning signs were clear. The HOA was tightening its grip, and this time it wasn't just about fines. This was about forcing conformity, and Mark wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. As he returned to his lawn, Mark realized this battle was about to escalate in a way he hadn't anticipated. The HOA wasn't going to just sit back and let things go. This wasn't going to be a simple exchange of letters and fines anymore. They were getting personal. Mark walked over to the clover patch, running his fingers through the lush green leaves. A sense of defiance stirred within him. He wasn't just standing up for a plant. This was about standing up for his right to exist, without constant surveillance, without being told every single thing he could or couldn't do. He pulled out his phone and began searching for ways to fight back. He knew he was up against something big, but now he had to make sure he had more than just words on paper. He needed something that would make Brenda think twice. Mark's determination was clear. He wasn't just fighting for his garden anymore. He was preparing for a war with the HOA, and this time, the battle wouldn't be won by fines or threats. The doorbell rang later that afternoon. Standing on his doorstep was a familiar face, Brenda, clipboard in hand, the same icy demeanor. Without saying a word, she handed him another letter, another fine. But this time, the warning was different. "Brenda, you have 72 hours to comply. If not, we'll take action. The fines will double, and you'll be responsible for all costs. You've been warned." She turned and walked away, without another word, her heels clicking against the pavement. Mark stood frozen for a moment, staring at the letter in his hands. He had no intention of backing down, but this time, it was clear the HOA wasn't going to give up. Mark knew it was coming. The next morning, the HOA enforcers were out in full force. They had a routine walk down the street, inspect every yard, make notes, and then leave a trail of stress behind them. This time, they had brought Brenda along with them, clipboard firmly in hand. She didn't even glance at Mark as they passed his house, but she made sure to stop at the edge of his lawn, staring down the clover patch, like it had personally offended her. As they walked past, Mark saw Brenda's eyes flick toward his property with that same contemptuous gaze. But she didn't leave it at that. No, this time was different. She'd been planning something. She turned to the enforcers and whispered something to them, all of them nodding as they continued their way down the street. Later that day, Mark was out in his yard, trimming the edges of the garden. His hands were busy, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel it, the tension in the air. The HOA wasn't going to stop at fines. They were escalating. And when he turned to look, he saw a black SUV parked across the street facing his driveway. A man sat behind the wheel, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, but Mark could tell he was watching. He didn't have to say a word. He just sat there taking notes on a small pad. Mark's blood boiled. He was being spied on now. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number. It rang a few times before a gruff voice answered. "Mark, Gus, I need you to do something for me. I need you to come by and look at my property. They're stepping up their game." Gus, the landscaper with a reputation for handling tough jobs, listened intently. "Gus, sounds like they're starting to play dirty. I'll be there in 30. Don't do anything crazy." Mark hung up his gaze, still fixed on the SUV. They had crossed a line, and now he needed a plan. When Gus arrived, he took one look at the SUV and the enforcer across the street and immediately understood. He rolled up in his old truck, parking casually near the edge of Mark's property, the kind of vehicle that wouldn't turn heads but still had a noticeable presence. Gus stepped out, his demeanor laid back but sharp as ever. "Gus, they're watching you, huh? Well, you're playing right into their game if you let them intimidate you." He walked over to the patch of clover, squatting down and inspecting it carefully, his hands brushing the leaves. "Gus, it's strong. Healthiest thing in this whole neighborhood if you ask me. They've got no real reason to come after you." Mark watched as Gus stood up, his eyes shifting over to the SUV across the street. Gus's voice lowered, but the sarcasm in it was unmistakable. "Gus, looks like they're looking for something to pick at. If you want to make them squirm, I can give you a little help, but it's going to take more than a few plants. We're going to need a little leverage." Mark nodded, understanding exactly what Gus meant. It was time to take things to the next level. That evening, Mark sat in front of his computer, reading through the HOA's legal documents again, scanning every page for any loopholes, any way to fight back. He wasn't just looking for technicalities anymore. He was looking for a way to outsmart them, and there it was. In one of the finer details of the bylaws, tucked away in a section about alternative ground cover, Mark found exactly what he needed. It wasn't just about the clover. It was about his ability to substitute turf for native plants, provided he followed specific procedures. And then, the real bombshell, there was no need for HOA approval if the plants were listed as native by the state. Mark printed out the page and stared at it, the wheels in his head turning. This was his escape route. He wasn't going to let the HOA dictate his property. He was going to turn their own rules against them. He called Gus again. "Mark, I've got a plan. We're going native, Gus. Real native." Gus let out a low whistle on the other end of the phone. "Gus, now we're talking. This is going to be fun." The next day, Mark had his plan in motion. Gus arrived with a van full of supplies, including a truckload of rare native Virginia plants. They were hardy, indestructible, and according to state regulations, legally protected. Gus, who had connections with some of the state's top botanists, had found the perfect plant. It wasn't just any native species. It was something that was rare and protected by federal law. Something that would make Brenda and her HOA tread lightly. They worked quickly, covering Mark's front yard with thick mats of Virginia wildflowers and plants that were both beautiful and incredibly difficult to remove. Each plant was more than just decoration. It was a message. As they worked, Mark saw the SUV across the street again. This time he didn't feel fear. He felt power. By mid-afternoon, the yard was nearly transformed. Mark stood back, admiring the wild garden, the scent of flowers and fresh earth heavy in the air. Gus wiped his brow, clearly satisfied with the work. The SUV was still parked across the street, but Mark wasn't worried anymore. This was his land, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. But he knew Brenda wasn't done. This wasn't over yet. A week had passed since the yard had been transformed into a wildflower garden, and Mark thought that maybe, just maybe, the HOA had finally gotten the message. Brenda had stayed quiet, at least outwardly, but Mark knew that wasn't going to last. The tension was palpable every time he stepped outside, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows of his neighbors' homes, wondering if someone was watching. He wasn't paranoid, but after years of dealing with the HOA, he'd learned to expect the worst. Then, one quiet morning, as Mark sat on his porch with a coffee in hand, he saw Brenda again, only this time she wasn't walking down the street alone. There was a man beside her, tall and professional-looking, carrying a binder and wearing dark sunglasses. The man looked like he had stepped out of a law office. Mark's stomach sank. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about the plants anymore. As they neared his property, Brenda glanced up at his yard, and Mark saw the moment of recognition in her eyes. She was sizing it up, her expression hardening, as she surveyed the wild garden that had taken root where his perfectly maintained lawn once stood. This wasn't just an HOA inspection. It was the beginning of something bigger. Brenda walked toward his front door, clipboard in hand, the legal advisor following closely behind her. Mark stood up, setting his coffee down with a heavy sigh. He had expected this, but now it was finally here. It was time to face the consequences of his defiance. Mark opened the door before Brenda had a chance to knock. Her cold eyes met his immediately, and her posture straightened. This wasn't a friendly chat. This was a showdown. "Brenda, Mark, we need to talk." Her voice was firm, but there was an edge of anger beneath it, like she was fighting to maintain control. Mark's gaze shifted to the man standing behind her. He was impeccably dressed, exuding the kind of authority that screamed lawyer, or at least someone who had more power than Mark did in this situation. He didn't need an introduction to know exactly who he was. This was the legal advisor she had mentioned, and that meant this was no longer just about Clover. This was war. Mark keeping his tone level. "What's this about now, Brenda?" Brenda stepped forward, her eyes locked on the garden. She was scanning the wildflowers, the native grasses, the deep green of the plants thriving where grass had once struggled. She almost seemed to take a personal offense to it. "Brenda, what you've done here, Mark, goes beyond a simple violation. It's illegal, and it's time to make you understand that." Her words hit like a slap. Mark's body stiffened. He knew they weren't just talking about weeds anymore. "Mark, illegal. You're saying plants are illegal." He tried to keep his tone light, but the undercurrent of frustration was impossible to hide. "Brenda, not just plants, Mark. What you've done here is a modification of the landscape without any approval from the HOA. And that," she turned to her legal advisor for support, "is something we cannot ignore." Mark's heart started to race. He had reverted his lawn to a natural state, thinking he was within the rules of the HOA. But apparently Brenda had found a way to twist the situation to her advantage. Brenda handed him a thick stack of papers from her legal advisor, who had remained silent up until now. The lawyer flipped the pages with a measured calm, finally pulling out one particular document that he handed to Mark. "Greg, the legal advisor, you've made some serious mistakes, Mark. According to this surveyor's report, you violated the property lines. The plants you've planted are now on HOA-controlled land." Mark stared at the page in disbelief. It took a moment for the words to sink in, but when they did, the ground seemed to shift beneath him. "Mark, wait, what?" "The plants are on HOA land." He scanned the survey map, his eyes locking on the marked lines showing that his garden had extended into shared HOA space. His stomach dropped. "Greg, that's right. You've altered the property boundaries without approval. And that mark is not just an HOA violation, it's a legal one. A modification of land use on HOA property is grounds for legal action. And that's exactly what we're going to pursue." Mark could barely breathe. He hadn't known. The boundaries had seemed so far away, and the plants were so harmless. How had he crossed this line without realizing it? The HOA had always been a suffocating presence, but now they had found a way to trap him. This was bigger than a fine. It was a legal issue. Brenda crossed her arms, a satisfied smirk appearing on her face. She had won this round, and she knew it. "Brenda, we'll give you one last chance, Mark. Remove everything by Friday, or we'll be forced to take further action. And trust me, we will sue you for damages and for the modification to community land. You'll pay for the restoration of this land and for any damage to our community's aesthetic." Mark's hands balled into fists. How had it come to this? He had tried to take a stand to fight for something natural and good, but now he was the one who might lose everything. The turf war he had started to defend his home had turned into a legal nightmare. "Mark, so I'm supposed to just rip it all out? After everything I've done, Brenda, you don't have a choice. The HOA is in control, Mark. You'll comply with the rules, or we will make you." Brenda turned to her legal advisor. Greg gave a small nod, and Mark felt the full weight of the situation settle over him. They were serious. Later that evening, Mark sat in front of his computer, staring at the documents the HOA had left him. His mind raced through his options. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. The plants weren't just some aesthetic decision for him. They were part of a larger message. But now, with the HOA threatening legal action and accusing him of altering property boundaries, Mark realized he needed a new weapon. He wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. He knew he had to take this fight to the next level. But how? How could he prove that his actions were legal? How could he turn the tables on Brenda and her legal team? That night, Mark scoured through the HOA's bylaws and Virginia state regulations. And then, as if by fate, he found it buried in a section about alternative ground cover, a clause that allowed homeowners to use native plants without prior approval if they were approved by the state as non-invasive species. And that's when it clicked. If he could prove that the plants he had chosen were legally protected, Brenda wouldn't just be fighting to remove his garden. She would be committing a federal offense. The next day, Mark called Gus, who had been more than happy to help him push back against the HOA. Gus had a reputation for dealing with all sorts of complicated landscaping projects, and now he had just the right solution. "Mark, I need the full legal paperwork on the plants. The federal protections. Can you get it, Gus?" "Yeah, I've got the papers, Mark." "This is the big play, huh?" Mark hung up, knowing that he had just found his ace in the hole. He wasn't just going to battle the HOA on property lines anymore. He was going to weaponize the law. And with the backing of the Endangered Species Act, he could force them to back off. As he prepared to gather his evidence and take his fight to the next level, he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was how he'd finally beat the HOA. Mark sat at his desk, papers scattered around him. He had gathered everything he needed: proof of the federal protections on his wildflowers, the original survey report, and most importantly, the legal documentation that proved his backyard was now an officially recognized critical habitat. He didn't want to admit it, but the sense of anticipation was building. It had been a week since Brenda's warning, and as much as he wanted to believe it, he knew the HOA wouldn't just give up without a fight. This was no longer just about plants or garden boundaries. This was now a battle between him and an entire system that had ruled the neighborhood for years. He could feel the pressure mounting. Every time he stepped outside, the sight of his newly cultivated garden reminded him that he was on the verge of something big and dangerous. The phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Gus, a simple text. "Gus, they're coming. Better be ready." Mark's blood ran cold. Gus didn't need to say more. He knew exactly what that meant. The HOA was making their move, and it wouldn't be long before they tried to force the issue. He wasn't just dealing with a few angry neighbors anymore. This had escalated into something much bigger. 2 days later, Mark was finishing up a call with his attorney, ensuring he had all his bases covered. As he hung up, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling up in front of his house interrupted his thoughts. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual slow-moving SUVs from the HOA. No, this time it was something much more serious. The vehicle was a black sedan, with tinted windows and a badge on the door that Mark had only seen in movies, the words, "Virginia Department of Environmental Protection," printed in bold letters. Before Mark could even react, the sedan's door swung open, and 2 men in suits stepped out. One of them, the taller of the two, had an air of authority that could only be described as intimidating. His cold eyes scanned the yard, and when he turned toward Mark, it was clear this wasn't going to be a conversation about Clover anymore. Agent Reynolds, Mark Henderson. His voice was low, controlled, and the tension behind it made Mark feel like he had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed. He nodded instinctively, stepping forward. "Mark, yes, I'm Mark. What's this about?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He simply gestured to the yard. "Reynolds, we're here because of this. This is a protected site under federal law, and I need you to step aside." The words federal law hit Mark harder than any HOA letter could. The realization sank in like a stone dropping into a quiet lake. His garden, his peaceful, defiant little garden, was under federal protection. The very thing he had fought for was now something much bigger than his neighborhood's petty disputes. Mark stood frozen for a moment, trying to wrap his mind around the situation. These weren't just state authorities. These were federal agents here to ensure that his garden was protected. He hadn't realized just how serious this situation had become. It was no longer about Brenda and her clipboard. It was about legal consequences, and if things went wrong, there could be criminal penalties involved. As the 2 agents approached the yard, Mark found his voice again. "Mark, wait, what do you mean I need to step aside? I've been following the rules." Reynolds turned to him, his expression stern but not unkind. "Reynolds, you've done more than just follow the rules, Mark. You've created a critical habitat, and now you're in danger of tampering with federal property. The plants you've installed here are part of an endangered species. This isn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This is a matter of federal law." Mark's pulse quickened. He wanted to argue, wanted to yell that he wasn't trying to break the law, that he was just trying to do something good. But the seriousness in Agent Reynolds' voice made him hesitate. He had done something good, but in the process he had unknowingly stepped into a much larger web. Reynolds glanced over at the other agent, who was already snapping photos of the yard, documenting everything meticulously. Then he looked back at Mark. "Reynolds, this is serious, Mark. You've got a federal habitat in your yard now, and if anything happens to it, if any damage occurs, it's not just a fine from the HOA. We're talking criminal charges, a fine of up to $50,000 per specimen, and even jail time if the habitat is disturbed. You need to make sure that no one touches anything, including the HOA." Mark swallowed hard. He had been prepared for a fight with Brenda and the HOA, but this was something else entirely. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he could feel the weight of the law bearing down on him. If things went wrong, he could lose everything. Agent Reynolds pulled out a notepad and began writing down something. He handed it to Mark along with his card. "Reynolds, this is the case number. We've already filed it with the federal court. The HOA cannot touch your yard. If they try, they'll be committing a federal offense. I'll be in touch with you regularly to ensure they don't step out of line." Mark took the card with trembling hands. He didn't know if this was a lifeline or a noose tightening around his neck. One thing was certain, this had just become a battle on a much bigger stage than he ever anticipated. Reynolds. But let me make one thing clear, Mark, don't provoke them. If you see anyone coming near that yard, you call us. Immediately. The two agents turned and walked back to their car, leaving Mark standing there feeling the gravity of the situation settle around him. As the agents drove off, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He was now legally protected, yes, but at what cost? He had learned that the fight he had started with the HOA had grown into something far more serious than he ever imagined. What had started as a small act of defiance had now turned into a legal standoff. Over the next few days, Mark watched his neighbors closely. He knew the HOA wasn't going to back down easily. They couldn't. They had too much invested in keeping the neighborhood under their control. But now, they had to deal with federal law. And, as the days passed, Mark felt the pressure mounting. He wasn't sure how this would end, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to give in. The days leading up to the HOA's scheduled intervention were tense. Mark sat on his porch, staring at his newly cultivated yard. It was quiet, but something in the air told him this uneasy peace wouldn't last long. The neighborhood felt different. Brenda had stayed quiet after the federal intervention the previous week, but Mark knew she wasn't done yet. She couldn't let this slide. Then one afternoon, he saw it. Brenda's SUV rolled down the street, and behind it the familiar black SUVs of the HOA. The contractors were back. The moment he'd feared had arrived. Mark's chest tightened as he saw the equipment, bulldozers, and heavy machinery pull up to his curb. The HOA had brought in backup. This was no longer just about fines. They were about to take action. Mark stepped out onto his porch, trying to steady his nerves. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Agent Reynolds. Reynolds, they're coming. Don't provoke them. I'll be there soon. Mark pocketed the phone and looked toward the yard. He had no choice but to face them now. They were going to tear it all down. He couldn't let that happen. Brenda was the first to step out of her SUV, followed closely by her legal team. They were walking with purpose, headed straight for Mark's yard. The contractors began unloading their equipment, ignoring the federal warning sign planted in the middle of the yard. Brenda gave Mark a fake smile, her posture, stiff clipboard in hand. She was enjoying this. Brenda, Mark, we've given you more than enough time. This disaster has gone on long enough. She gestured to the wildflowers, and Moss clearly offended by their presence. Mark, you can't do this, Brenda. It's federally protected now. You know that. But Brenda wasn't listening. She was too focused on her own power to acknowledge the legal consequences. Brenda, I've had enough of this, Mark. You've had your chances. This is a community, not a nature preserve. You've broken the rules, now we're going to fix it. She signaled the contractors to begin, and the bulldozer rumbled to life. Mark stood his ground, watching as the bulldozer's bucket lowered, ready to tear up the garden. His heart raced, but he kept his composure. As much as he hated it, he knew what he had to do. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed Agent Reynolds again. Mark, they're going to start tearing it up. You need to stop them. Reynolds calmly, I'm on my way. Do not engage. Stay out of their way. We've got this. Mark clenched his fists but stepped back from the machinery. He couldn't risk making a move before the agents arrived. Brenda had no idea what was about to hit her. The noise of the bulldozer's engine filled the air as it approached the yard, but just as it was about to lower its bucket, a loud siren sounded down the street. The unmistakable blue and red flashing lights of a federal vehicle turned the corner. Mark's heart leaped into his chest. It was Agent Reynolds, and he wasn't alone. Two federal agents stepped out of the black SUV, their presence overwhelming. They were dressed in tactical gear, the kind that made everyone stop and take notice. They walked with authority, moving toward the bulldozer. Agent Reynolds, stop right there. The bulldozer operator froze, unsure of what was happening. He looked up at the federal agents, clearly intimidated. Brenda spun around, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time. Brenda, what is this? Who are you? You can't just Agent Reynolds. This property is under federal protection. You are in violation of the Endangered Species Act. If you proceed with this abatement, you will face criminal charges. Brenda's face went white. She hadn't expected this. Mark could see it. She was trying to regain control, but it was slipping away. The contractors stood still, uncertain of what to do. Reynolds, to the contractors, turn off the machines. Now. The bulldozer operator slowly climbed out of the cab, his face pale. Brenda was fuming, but there was nothing she could do. Federal law was in play now. Brenda's bravado finally broke. She stepped forward, but Agent Reynolds blocked her path. Reynolds, step back, ma'am. You've been warned. If you step onto this property, you're committing federal trespass. I suggest you leave now. Brenda's eyes flashed with rage. She wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone like Reynolds. But the reality was clear now. She was caught in a legal trap. "Brenda, I'm not going anywhere. This is my community." But the agent wasn't backing down. "Reynolds, no ma'am. This is federal land. You don't get to decide anymore. You've already broken the law by attempting to destroy a protected habitat. Do you want to make it worse for yourself?" Brenda took a step back, her shoulders slumping. She looked defeated. Mark stood there watching the entire scene unfold. He had won, but not just in the way he expected. He wasn't fighting for a pretty lawn anymore. He was fighting for his freedom from the HOA, for the rights of his garden, and for something much bigger than himself. Agent Reynolds turned to Mark, giving him a nod of approval. Mark had played this smart, and now the federal authorities were on his side. Brenda had lost. The HOA had been defeated. As Brenda was led away, visibly shaken, Mark felt a wave of relief. The garden, his hard-fought victory, was safe. He had outsmarted the HOA and even federalized his fight. He turned to Gus, who had been standing by watching the whole thing. Gus gave him a grin. "Gus, you've got a wild one here, Mark. I didn't think it would go this far, but damn, it worked." Mark smiling. "It's not just a garden, Gus. It's freedom." As the agents wrapped things up and the contractors packed away their equipment, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He had fought back against the system, and this time, the little guy had come out on top. The morning was hot and still as Mark sat on his porch, his fingers tapping the side of his coffee mug, watching the neighborhood from behind the cool shade of his house. He'd been waiting for this moment for days, and now it was finally here. The HOA's contractors were coming, and they weren't just here to prune a bush or lay down sod. They had come to tear it all down, and nothing would stop them now. Brenda, with her clipboard in hand and that smug smile plastered on her face, was leading the charge. He could already see the white SUV pull up to the curb, followed by a line of trucks filled with heavy machinery. This was it. The final showdown. Brenda's team had come with all their tools, ready to strip away everything he had fought for. But Mark wasn't afraid anymore. He'd done everything he could to protect his garden, and now the battle was about to get much bigger. Mark stood up from his chair as Brenda got out of the SUV, her posture stiff and proud like a commander walking onto the battlefield. She was surrounded by her legal team, a group of men who looked uncomfortable in their ill-fitting suits, and the contractors who were already setting up their equipment. Brenda, coldly, "Mark, it's time to end this. You've had your chances. The HOA's community standards are being destroyed by that garden of yours." She looked at the federal warning sign Mark had placed in the yard, clearly unimpressed by the legal power behind it. She wasn't going to back down. Mark calmly, "You don't get it, Brenda. This garden is protected by federal law. You can't touch it, not without facing the consequences." Brenda's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Brenda, oh, we'll see about that. I've got a signed contract with the contractors. This is going through whether you like it or not. You're just wasting everyone's time." Mark stood firm, but his heart was racing. He had known this day would come, and now there was no turning back. "Mark, I'm not the one wasting time here. The federal law has already spoken. If you go any further, it won't just be a fine. You'll be committing a federal crime." Brenda took another step forward, her heels clicking against the pavement. The contractors began to fire up their machinery, ready to tear down Mark's garden. But Mark didn't back down. He pulled out his phone and dialed Agent Reynolds. "Mark, they're here. It's happening now. They're about to tear it up." Reynolds calmly, "Don't engage. Stay where you are. We're on our way." Mark felt a cold surge of confidence. He wasn't alone in this. But as the machinery started to move, he knew this was his moment. Brenda smiled, convinced that the battle was over. The bulldozer rolled toward the yard, the earth beneath its tires shaking with each movement. Mark didn't move. He simply stood there watching the machinery come closer. Just as the bulldozer's bucket was about to drop, the sound of sirens wailed down the street. Mark felt his heart race as the federal agents arrived. The black SUVs rolled up, and Agent Reynolds stepped out first, his badge clearly visible. The man was all business. He had come to shut it all down. Reynolds to the contractors, "Stop, shut everything down." The bulldozer operator froze, unsure of what to do. He looked from the agents to Brenda, who was already trying to regain control of the situation. Brenda shouting, "What is this? You can't do this. We have a signed contract. This is our property." But Agent Reynolds wasn't fazed. He stood tall, calm, and in control. His next words were the final nails in the coffin. Reynolds to Brenda, "Mom, this property is now federally protected. Any attempt to proceed with this abatement will be a federal crime." Brenda's confident facade crumbled in an instant. She took a step back, visibly shaken. She had no idea that the situation had escalated this far. The contractors began looking at each other, nervously unsure of what to do next. Reynolds, to the contractors, "Shut it down. Don't touch anything. You've been warned." Mark couldn't believe it. It was really happening. The bulldozer was powered down, and everything came to a halt. It was no longer a fight over grass. It was a fight against federal law. Brenda's arrogance was starting to show cracks. She stepped forward again, clearly frustrated and angry, but Reynolds blocked her path. "Reynolds, you're not listening, ma'am. I've already told you. If you step onto this property again, you'll be committing federal trespassing. I suggest you step back." Brenda was furious, but there was no escaping the reality of the situation. The federal agents had arrived, and they were here to stay. The law was no longer on her side. Brenda to Mark, "This is ridiculous. You think you've won? You've just made this worse for yourself." Mark, calmly, "It's over, Brenda. The law is on my side now. You can't just do whatever you want." The contractors packed up their equipment, and Brenda stood there, staring in disbelief at the agents who were now documenting the violation. Mark had taken the fight to the highest level. As Brenda stood there helpless, Agent Reynolds looked at Mark and nodded. It was over. They had won. The federal law had intervened, and there was no way the HOA could recover from this. Brenda was led away by one of the federal officers. As she passed Mark, she gave him a glare full of venom, but Mark didn't flinch. "Brenda, you'll regret this, Mark. You'll pay for this." But Mark stood tall, his victory complete. "Reynolds, it's over. The HOA's reign is done." Mark watched as the last of the contractors drove away, their machines now silent. The federal agents finished documenting the evidence, and Mark's garden was safe. He had fought back, and he had won. The battle was won, but the aftermath was just beginning. Brenda was arrested for violating federal law, and the HOA had no choice but to back down. The community was in shock. As the news spread, the federal intervention had changed everything. The HOA, once a powerful force in the neighborhood, had been exposed for its overreach. The legal consequences were swift. Brenda was charged with multiple violations, including destruction of protected property, and faced heavy fines. The HOA was slapped with a massive civil penalty, and the board members were left scrambling to recover. But the damage had been done. Dave, the vice president of the HOA, came to Mark's door a week later, looking disheveled and defeated. "Dave, Mark, they're dissolving the board. Brenda's out. Everyone's out. The fines, they're astronomical. We're all paying for this mess." Mark calmly, "How much are they asking, Dave?" $2,000 per household. "To cover the fines. The HOA's insolvent." Mark just nodded. It was bittersweet. He had won, but at a heavy cost to the entire community. Mark stood outside, his eyes on the garden, still alive and thriving despite everything. It was ugly to some, but to him it was a symbol of freedom. It wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The HOA was defeated, and Mark had come out victorious. As he looked at the moss, now thriving and protected by federal law, he smiled. The victory wasn't just his, it was for everyone who had ever felt oppressed by the system. The battle might have been over, but Mark had changed the game forever. The following days were a blur for Mark, but the air in the neighborhood had shifted. What was once a place of tension and control was now strangely quiet. Brenda's absence hung heavily over the neighborhood. Her house sat empty as the community felt the ripple effects of her downfall. Mark spent the next few days alone, his mind reflecting on the roller coaster of events. The neighbors, once distant and wary, now started to approach him, offering thanks and quiet nods of approval. The very same people who had been too scared to speak up against the HOA were now coming forward, thanking him for taking a stand. One morning, Dave from next door showed up at his door. He looked haggard, worn down by the fallout of everything that had transpired. "Dave, I can't believe you actually pulled it off, Mark. Brenda's gone. The board's gone. It's like we're living in a different world now." Mark smiling faintly. "Yeah, things are changing." The weight of everything that had happened hung over them both. The HOA, once a powerful entity in the neighborhood, had been brought to its knees. The community was no longer just a place to live. It was a place where individuals now felt free to make their own choices. It didn't take long for the full impact of Brenda's actions to be felt. The federal penalties hit the HOA hard, and the board members were left scrambling to find a way out. The fines were unprecedented, and the HOA's insurance company refused to cover the costs, citing that the violation was willful. The final bill was staggering: $150 0 penalties, along with legal fees, restoration costs, and the repairs needed to fix the damage done to the moss. The HOA was financially ruined. There was nothing left to be done. As the legal fallout poured in, the community realized that their once oppressive HOA had no more control over their lives. The HOA members who had supported Brenda were either resigning or being forced to leave under the weight of the scandal. Dave, who had been swept up in Brenda's agenda, was now part of the rebuilding effort, but his role was minimal. Dave, the board's dissolved. Mark, we can't afford to keep the HOA running. We're having a community meeting tonight to figure out what happens next. But it's clear the HOA's days are over. Mark felt a deep sense of relief. The oppressive force that had controlled the neighborhood for so long was now a shadow of its former self. There would be no more fines, no more ridiculous rules. It was a fresh start, one that came at a heavy price. Weeks passed and the neighborhood slowly found its footing. Without the HOA's heavy hand, the vibrancy of the community returned. Mark's garden, the heart of his battle, had not only survived, it had thrived. The moss was still dormant, but the tiny sporophytes had started to grow, an unspoken reminder to everyone that change was possible. One day, Gus came by to check on the moss. As always, he arrived in his old truck, ready to share a beer and talk shop. Gus, you know, Mark, I've been thinking, we could probably get the moss delisted in a few years. If it stabilizes, we could even apply for a permit to remove it. Mark, laughing, remove it? You want to destroy this mess, Gus? Well, no, but it's pristine. Federal law would probably let you take it out for some landscaping work. You could go back to grass, asterisk, asterisk, Mark grinning, nah. I think it's perfect just the way it is. As they sat on the porch sipping beer, Gus looked out over the yard and smiled. Gus, you've made a garden, man. A real one. I'd never thought I'd see the day when someone took on the feds over moss. Mark, chuckling, sometimes you've got to stand your ground. You don't know what you're capable of until you're pushed. The neighborhood had started to recover. Brenda's house sat on the market for months, a stark reminder of what had once been. But eventually a young couple moved in, eager to take the house. They were different. They didn't care about the moss or the HOA. They just wanted a place to live, a place where they could make their own decisions. They planted wildflowers in the front yard, leaving Mark's moss to grow undisturbed. As for Mark, he had won. Not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. He had turned his defiance into a symbol of freedom. Brenda had lost, and with her the grip the HOA had on the neighborhood. Mark's victory was something bigger than just a garden. It was about standing up to the system, to the rules, and showing everyone that no one should ever have to live under the thumb of a small, petty authority. He didn't need a perfect lawn to be happy, he just needed his home. As Mark looked out at the garden, the federal sign still stood at the center of the yard, a final symbolic reminder of the victory he had earned. The moss, once an eyesore to the HOA, had become something more, a living testament to the fight he had won. Mark whispering to himself, it grows on you, like a fungus. He closed his eyes, feeling the warm sun on his face, a sense of peace settling over him. The battle was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. And for Mark, that was all that mattered. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It wasn't the satisfaction of seeing Brenda escorted away in handcuffs or the HOA's downfall. It was the fact that in the end, following the law made all the difference. The legal process, not anger or revenge, turned the tide. If I had taken matters into my own hands, if I'd let the emotions take over, I know this would have ended very differently. The law gave me the strength to stand firm and ensure fairness. When we feel powerless, it's easy to think that taking the law into our own hands is the only way to fight back. But standing up legally doesn't mean we lose the battle. It means we fight with the right tools. We have to be patient, gather evidence, follow the process, and let it work. Anger and violence won't win. Only clear, documented actions will. The truth is, when you stand up for what's right, keep records, and follow the right channels, you are protecting more than just your own rights. You're protecting the entire community. Know when to involve the authorities, and know that the right outcome takes time, but it's always worth it. Communities thrive when people respect the law, when they hold each other accountable, and when they support the system that holds everything together. It's not about power, it's about respect. My backyard, my small patch of moss, was a symbol of that balance. Just as the moss thrives when nurtured by the right conditions, so too does a community when the law is respected and upheld.